Welcome. Good evening. I'm Jessica Harkins, Associate Professor of English at CSB SJU, and it's my pleasure to introduce Solmaz Sharif. Before we start, I am to remind everyone to turn off their cell phones. Thank you. I would like to thank the people responsible for our opportunity to host Solmaz Sharif on our campuses. In particular, I would like to thank Mark Conway, Director of the CSB Literary Arts Institute, and not only for tonight, but for his unflagging devotion to the arts. This year marks the 20th year anniversary of the CSB Literary Arts Institute, a legacy born of Mark's hard work and vision. I would also like to thank the English department, our invaluable longtime partner in the cities, Grey Wolf Press, and the Manitou Group for its continued and vital support of LAI. I would also like to direct your attention to the broadsides of Solmaz Sharif's poems, which is outside as we go, created by art faculty Rachel Malis, Scott Murphy, and Andrea Shaker. Following the reading, there will be a brief Q&A, after which these broadsides, as well as her extraordinary book, are available for purchase. A few biographical notes. Solmaz Sharif, was born in Istanbul to Iranian parents. She has degrees from UC Berkeley and New York University, and her work has appeared in several contemporary journals, and her accolades include numerous literary awards and fellowships. Currently, she's a Jones Lecturer at Stanford University. Look, fabulous book. Is her first poetry collection, and it was published by Grey Wolf Press in 2016. It was a finalist for the National Book Award, and it has been widely recognized for its literary achievement. Okay, so now to the introduction proper. Contemporary Polish philosopher Zygmunt Bauman characterizes our present moment in the wake of terrorism and the refugee crises. We are walking, he writes, that's my favorite metaphor, as if on a minefield. We are aware that the field is full of explosives, but we can't tell where there will be an explosion and when. There are no solid structures around us all on which we can rely, in which we can invest our hopes and expectations. Even the most powerful governments very often cannot deliver on their promise. They don't have enough power to do so. Dangers have always existed, Bauman argues, but today things are different. He says we live in a state of continuous uncertainty, which makes us afraid. I read Bauman as including everyone, all persons, in this fear, though of course some groups of people are more physically and emotionally vulnerable as a result of it and the forms of violence that ensue. The poems in Look address the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, as well as the present-day war on terror. They address the literal minefield, the actual mine, and the attempts by military language to hide it from view. As the New York Times Book Review points out, Sharif shows us that the diameter of a word is often as devastating as the diameter of a bomb. Terms from the United States Department of Defense's Dictionary of Military and Associated Terms, terms like collateral damage, we've all heard those kind of euphemisms in newspeak, appear in small caps in the majority of the poems. Sharif reveals how these euphemisms obscure the realities of war by looking at what is happening to many people. Her poems speak from the points of view of soldiers, detainees, the narrator, a family member writing to a loved one in Guantanamo Bay whose letters are being defaced and blacked out. To appreciate the poems in Look, one can inhabit our present moment. One can also step back, way back in time, all the way to the Iliad, that first work of early Western literature, to take in how the poet is writing a new poetry of war. I think it is also illuminating to look at her work in relation to the 20th century poets who wrote about the world wars. And this is in quotations. The psychiatrist Dore Laab has found that in the oral testimony of survivors of the Shoah, their accounts fragment as they approach the core of the trauma. The narrative of trauma is itself traumatized and bears witness to extremity by its inability to articulate directly or completely. In literature, as poet Carolyn Forche notes, The French call this procedure récit éclaté, a shattered, exploded, or splintered narrative. The story cannot travel over time and space. Violence has rendered it unspeakable. The poems in Look engage with these histories and the form of the fragment, among others, to restore meaning to language. The importance of such fragments cannot be overstated. As Ludwig Wittgenstein has written, the poem might be our only evidence that an event has occurred. It exists for us as the sole trace of an occurrence. And there is, of course, what Thomas Adorno said about poetry or art, really, after the Holocaust. There is no longer beauty or consolation except in the gaze falling on horror, withstanding it, and in unalleviated consciousness of negativity, holding fast to the possibility of something better. Sharif's art records occurrences, resists forces of erasure, and withstands horrors without surrendering hope. In parting, a reading circle of our students shared their views with me of her work as well, and they report, Sharif's writing is both raw and real. Her style makes even the most uncomfortable subjects readable and understandable. And there is a stark contrast between Sharif's use of beautiful, intimate language and the disturbing and painful nature of her message. This contrast unearthed within me a mixture of awe and discomfort at the amount of pain and suffering that I do not know. Please join me in welcoming Solmaz Sharif.
Wow, that was beautiful. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I've had such a spectacular 2 days here. I can't thank you enough for your hospitality. Thank you, Mark, for having me out here. It's a real honor and a real pleasure. And the small talk part of a reading is not my strong suit, so I tend to just get right into it, if that's all right. I'm going to read a poem I think that maybe will speak to what Jessica just gorgeously described, and that kind of fragmentation. It's the last poem of the book, actually. It's called Drone, and it opens with an epitaph from Frank Bedart, who just won the National Book Award. Very excited. From a poem that he wrote in the voice of Nijinsky. And the quote reads, "Let this be the body through which the war has passed." Drone. Somewhere I did not learn mow down or mop up. Somewhere I wouldn't hear, "Your father must come with me," or "I must fingerprint your grandmother. Can you translate, please?" The FBI has my cousin's computers. My father says, "Say whatever you want over the phone." My father says, "Don't let them scare you. That's what they want." My mother has a hard time believing anything's bugged. My father and I always talk like the world listens. My father is still on the bus with contraband papers under his seat as uniforms storm down the aisle. It was my job to put a cross on each home with dead for clearing. It was my job to dig graves into the soccer field. I wrote red tracksuit. I wrote Shahida, headless, found beside Sad Mosque, buried in the same grave as the above. I wrote unidentified fingers found inside Oldsmobile car. I wrote their epitaphs in chalk. From my son's wedding mattress, I know this mounds his room. I dropped a knee and engaged the enemy. I emptied my clip, then finished the job. I took 2 steps in and threw a grenade. I took no more than 2 steps into a room before firing. In Haditha, we cleared homes Fallujah style. My father was reading the Quran when they shot him through the chest. They fired into the closet, the kitchen, the 90-year-old, the stove. Just where was I? Una tu cara en todos los buses urbanos. Here lie the mortal remains of one who in life searched your face. Call me when you get home. Let's miss an appointment together. Let's miss another flight to repeated strip searches. That Haditha bed with magenta queen sheets and wood-shelved headboard and blood splattered up the walls to the ceiling. They held each other. They slept on opposing ends, wishing one would leave. Mother doesn't know who I am anymore. I write Mustafa Muhammad Khalaf. 15 months old. I write, "Here lies an unknown martyr, a big security guard with a blue shirt found near an industrial area with a chain of keys. Martyr unknown, only bones." They ask if I have anything to declare, then limit my response to fruits and nuts. An American interrupts an A&B conversation to tell me, "You don't have to do anything you don't want to do." He strikes me as a misstep away from, "She was asking for it." What did you expect after fishing Popoff from a trash bin? What did you expect after accepting a marbled palace? They drag the man who killed my uncle out a hole. They inspect him for ticks on national television. No one in my family celebrates. When the FBI knocks, I tell them, "I don't have to do anything I don't want to do," and they get a kick out of that. She just laid there and took it like a champ. She was dying for it. At a protest, a man sells a shirt that reads, "My dick would pull out of a rock." My mother tape records my laugh to mail bubble-wrapped back home. My mother records me singing, "Ye shab mahtab, mah miyad tu khab." I am singing "The moon will come one night and take me away side street by side street," sitting on a pilled suburban carpet or picking blue felt off the hand-me-down couch, the displaced whatnots. I practice the work of worms, how much I can wear away with no one watching. 2 generations ago, my blood moved through borders according to grazing and seasons. Then a lifeline of planes. Planes fly so close to my head, filled with bomblets and disappeared men. Scaffolding sprouts nooses sagging with my dead. I burn my finger on the broiler and smell trenches, my uncle pissing himself. Shopping bags or legs, there's half a head in the gutter. I say, "Hello, NSA," when I place a call. Somewhere a file details my sexual habits. Some tribunal may read it all back to me. Gole sorchi, I know the cell they will put me in. They put me onto a crooked pile of others to rot. Is this what happens to a brain born into war, a city of broken teeth, the thuds of falling? We have learned to sing a child calm in a bomb shelter. I am singing to her still. Reaching Guantanamo. Dear Salim, love, are you well? Do they, you? I worry so much. Lately, my hair, even my skin, the doctors tell me I believe them, it shouldn't. Please don't worry. In the yard, and moths have gotten to your mothers. Remember? I've enclosed some, made this batch just for you. Please eat well. Why did you, me to remarry? I told, and he couldn't, I would never. Love, I'm singing that you loved. Remember the line that went, I'm holding that just for you. Yours? So I visited a few classes today. And so some of the poems are kind of just continuing conversations that began in those classes. And one of the conversations, or one of the questions that was raised was around how to know what one has a right to write about, or who one, whom one has a right to write about. And I have a long poem in here called Personal Effects that's about an uncle of mine who was a draftee and was killed in the Iran-Iraq War, which is a war he didn't actually want to fight in. He wanted to go AWOL, but his family refused to help him in that and encouraged him to go. And he died before I got to meet him, and he had on his body a slim photo album, and he had also written some letters that he had sent back home from the front lines. And, around these things, family doesn't talk much. Some families don't. My family doesn't necessarily. And so I'm trying to write into something that I don't actually know about. I've never met him. I don't know what my claim to ownership over him is necessarily, other than blood. And I'm not sure that that really matters with somebody that you haven't met or grown up around in that same way. And yet I had to. I felt, a moral and political imperative, an obligation to kind of write about a life that would otherwise be completely erased and obliterated. And so I'll read a few parts of it. It's about 30 pages. I won't read all 30. I'll read a few parts of it, and hopefully I will catch a few parts that talk more directly to that writing what you don't necessarily know or don't necessarily have a right to write about. So, personal effects. Daily I sit with the language they've made of our language to neutralize the capability of low dollar value items like you. You were what is referred to as a casualty, unclear whether from a catalytic or frontal attack, unclear the final time you were addressed, thou beloved. It was for us a catastrophic event, just destroyed, died of wounds received in action. Yes, there was early warning. You said you were especially scared of mortar rounds. In execution planning, they weighed the losses, the sustainability, and budgeted for X number. They budgeted for the phone call to your mother and weighed that against the amount saved in rations and your taste for cigarettes and the tea you poured your boys and the tea you would have poured me approaching, hello, the change you collected in jars, jumping a bit as the family learns to slam the home's various doors. How could she say the things she does not know? A poison-tipped arrow, she told classmates at recess, to the neck. Hollow whistle of it launched from a blowgun, cutting the air between them. According to most definitions, I have never been at war. According to mine, most of my life spent there. Anthrax and salt and pepper shakers, patrol car windshields with crosshairs painted over them, some badge holding my father's pocket contents up to him and asking where the cash is from. The war in Iraq, I read, is over now, the last wheel gathering into themselves as they lift off the sad tarmac. I say, begin. I say, end. And you are to believe this is what happens. I say, chew 40 times before swallowing, slime. And you go home to mother, press a dog tag to your temple, press a gun to that, the tag flowering into your skull. Thank God for all-weather floor mats and the slope of my personal driveway, and beer cans that change color to let me know they are cold enough, the full-sized cab smelling of iron and Axe body spray. In 2003, a man held a fistful of blood and brains to a PBS camera and yelled, "Is this the freedom they want for us?" It was from his friend's head. They were marching as they figured Americans do. Between them hardly 3 horsepower, and still we shot him. We say the war is over, but still the woman leans across the passenger seat. My son, I wasn't there, so I can't know, can I? His mother's bed, a grief we don't attempt to console. I killed him, she'll tell me years later. I killed him, she'll say in the midst of civil affairs. He surprises, he arrives, eyes taped shut, torso held together by black thread, fridge cold. Grief is a closed area, cluttered with his fork against the plate and other forgotten musics. The enlarged ID photo above her mantle means I can know amu, my dear collateral damage, as only a state or a school might do. What I see are your hands peeling apples, the skin curling to the floor in one long unravel, a spit-up film reel loosened from its canister. And I'm not even sure they are apples, pear, some desert potato with a stem. From the number of peels, I assume you are feeding the other men in your tent. Your head is down. Maybe the cameraman asked you to look at him and you couldn't stomach it. Maybe around you today they fell until you didn't understand how you hadn't been hit. I decide you are happy for the knife in your hands, the white dust on your bare feet. I am happy to see your bare feet in this photo. They are the only things that made me cry. It's that they existed and that they, appalling, look so dead already. I think it's fair to say you want to do something with your hands, whether or not the photographer placed the apples in front of you, whether or not they are apples, whether or not earlier that day you saw a friend's lungs peeking out the back of his throat. I cannot name the weapons leaning on the wall behind you, Kalashnikovs, howitzers. As you write a letter, I wrote, I burn my finger on the broiler and smell trenches, my uncle pissing himself. How can she write that? She doesn't know. A friend, a daughter of a Vietnam vet, told another friend, another daughter of a Vietnam vet. I think I might have neglected to mention that the book deals in part with the U.S. Department of Defense's dictionary, and that the U.S. Department of Defense has written its own dictionary to supplement standard English dictionaries. And so throughout the poems that I've been reading, terms that the DoD have redefined to fit their war-specific context have been used in small caps, and were in part something that also, strangely or sickly or however we want to think about it, a way that allowed me to also access and imagine what my uncle might have been experiencing, or somehow get him closer to at least the language, even though it's a different language, it's English, it's not Farsi, right? But at least the kind of language that must have been around his head immediately before he died, you know? So in that way, it gave me an intimacy with him that I wouldn't have been able to have otherwise. Not that I want to give credit, but I have to, where it's due, I guess. If it's all right with you all, I'd like to read the title poem, and maybe after that we can take some questions and have a conversation. The title poem is Look, and the title is taken from a term that the DoD has redefined to mean, they have redefined the word look to mean, in mine warfare, a period during which a mind circuit is receptive of an influence. Look. It matters what you call a thing. Exquisite, a lover called me exquisite. Whereas, well, if I were from your culture living in this country, said the man outside the 2004 Republican National Convention, I would put up with that for this country. Whereas I felt the need to clarify, you would put up with torture, you mean? And he proclaimed, yes. Whereas what is your life? Whereas years after, they look down from their jets and declare my mother's Abadan block probably destroyed. We walked by the villas, the faces of buildings torn off into dioramas, and recorded it on a handheld camcorder. Whereas it could take as long as 16 seconds between the trigger pulled in Las Vegas and the Hellfire missile landing in Mazar-e-Sharif, after which they will ask, did we hit a child? No, a dog, they will answer themselves. Whereas the federal judge at the sentencing hearing said, I want to make sure I pronounce the defendant's name correctly. Whereas this lover would pronounce my name and call me exquisite and lay the floor lamp across the floor, softening even the light. Whereas the lover made my heat rise so that if heat sensors were trained on me, they could read my thermal shadow through the roof and through the wardrobe. Whereas it's not like seeing a dead body walking to the grocery store here. It's not like that. It's Iraq, you know, it's Iraq. It's kind of like acceptable to see that there and not. It was kind of like seeing a dead dog or a dead cat lying. Whereas I thought if he would look at my exquisite face or my father's, he would reconsider. Whereas, you mean I should be disappeared because of my family name? And he answered, yes, that's exactly what I mean, adding that his wife helped draft the Patriot Act. Whereas the federal judge wanted to be sure he was pronouncing the defendant's name correctly and said he had read all the exhibits, which included the letter I wrote to cast the defendant in a loving light. Whereas today we celebrate things like his transfer to a detention center closer to home. Whereas his son has moved across the country. Whereas I made nothing happen. Whereas ye know not what shall be on the morrow, for what is your life? It is even a thermal shadow. It appears so little and then vanishes from the screen. Whereas I cannot control my own heat, and it can take as long as 16 seconds between the trigger, the Hellfire missile, and a dog, they will answer themselves, whereas a dog, they will say. Now, therefore, let it matter what we call a thing. Let it be the exquisite face for at least 16 seconds. Let me look at you. Let me look at you in a light that takes years to get here. Thank you. I am so happy to take questions and eager to hear them if there are any. And also patient and willing to stay in silence for uncomfortable amounts of time.
Would you repeat the new definition of look?
Sure. In mind warfare, the period during which a mind circuit is receptive of an influence, which I have taken to mean the influence as usually the body, the person that's stepping on the mind, receptive of, so it's armed. Yeah. So for me, the definition itself is such a great example of the kind of linguistic acrobatics that the DoD has to do and that we have to do in order to be able to justify and look away from or make tolerable violence that we commit. Yeah.
Me? Okay. I was just curious, what inspired you to start writing, and whether you had somebody in your family maybe who wrote poetry, or is it just something that, just spoke in your heart that caused you to write?
My mom has always been into literature, and she would read me. Actually, she would read from Song of Myself as my bedtime story, but she'd censor it, which, I mean, I don't think I understood either way, really, but, she's very interesting. She was an activist, and she was organizing against the Shah of Iran, who was a dictator in Iran, and at some point, literature became a very bougie activity that had no place in real, kind of real political work. And so she put it aside. And shortly after that, then she had me. And so she had to get a kind of real job or, go into a more dependable line of work. And so she started majoring in mathematics. So, but I would say her influence, and also the fact that I just grew up around a lot of like classical Persian music that are just, the vocals are actually poems. They're, it's Rumi or Hafez being sung. I still don't understand, but the cadence of it I carry and is translated in my work too. So it was just always around me. And it always felt amazing to me that somebody could do that, yeah.
Oh, I see. Yesterday at lunch, we happened to talk about some of the formal decisions that went into the Guantanamo Bay home. Mm-hmm. Wondered, would you mind talking about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a series of poems in here, and I read one of them. It's Reaching Guantanamo. It's the one where there's some silences in between. And the inspiration for that poem was actually an article in the New York Times written in 2008 about the mental health of Guantanamo detainees. And in that article, they wrote specifically about one whose name was Salim Hamdan, and at that time had been in prison for 7 years at Guantanamo and had only been allowed 2 phone calls home. So he had like a daughter born after he had been, detained and had never seen her or seen a likeness of her. And there was just a line in there that said that letters that reach Guantanamo inmates are often late and heavily redacted by the Joint Task Force. And there was no way at that time that we could go and find such a letter, and all I got was that information. And it just seemed to me that needed to exist as an imagined work, at least, and an interrogation in that way. So I wrote this series of imagined poems to him where I have blanked out words, and the words that I've blanked out, I've never actually filled. I didn't write an entire letter and then take out words. What you don't know, I don't know. So, because for me, what was important was not writing a thing and then keeping you, the reader, from the thing that I know. What was important is that we all experience the grief and the upset that comes with having to read such a letter from a loved one and having to doubt yourself in reading that. Like, oh, obviously there's only one word that could fit there. Why would they ever black that word out? Am I even, am I all here if that's what I'm thinking? So that was a part of it for me ethically, that I didn't want to how I talk about it is that I wanted to enact the violence and, you know, have us all look at the violence that's being done to the text, to an intimate letter. But I didn't want to enact the role of the Joint Task Force. And if I had just written it out and blacked it out, that's what I would have been doing. And then the other thing is that instead of using like black bars, I use white space, which is more open, which, as Rachel pointed out, also invites more of a kind of input from the reader to imagine what might be there, whereas a black bar is almost more comforting because you can see where it ends, you can see how tall it is, and it feels so impenetrable and so just done and wiped out that I am less likely to then try and fill it in or then try and imagine it, as opposed to like a white space that I can, you know, is more upsetting in a lot of ways, actually, though more open.
Have you sent this collection of poetry to the Department of Defense?
But I should, yeah.
I was thinking about, obviously, sort of the dictionary, the Department of the Dictionaries would be an example of something that you read very carefully in the process of writing these poems. And sometimes when we're talking about writing, even sort of in a classroom, we'll talk about, with creative writing too, a process of research that, and I wondered if you could say a little bit about how it, did you sit down and think, I'm going to research about this or this or this, whether it's like a family history or talking to people or finding this in a document, or is it something that just kind of moved in fits and starts as you were approaching your subject?
Well, I love research. I mean, that's where I'm happiest, is to have a thing to go and find in the library and then try and find that thing and then find the thing that's next to it that has nothing to do with that thing and then go with that for a while and have time to do that, you know, is just amazing. And in terms of the dictionary itself, I've read through it, but I used the terms and I did not use the definitions. And at some point, I even just stopped reading the definitions because the definitions are that deadening to read. And what was important and I wanted to mark were the words that we use and what associations we might have with them and what questions come up when we know that that word is also, a word like apron is also being used by the Department of Defense, and what kind of violence might be behind that term or not. Some of the terms are kind of benign or, just very esoteric and, bureaucratic in that kind of way. So it was important for me to not have too much of the DoD in it, in my own head too, because I didn't want to stay in just responding to the DoD. I wanted to be showing where the DoD exists in the English language rather than having a conversation with them, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Perhaps everyone knows this, but how did you get your hands on a copy of the dictionary?
We all can. It's a public document, and it's a PDF, and it's up online, and it's updated regularly. So actually, the edition I work with is the 2007 edition, and no longer exists. But there's no way that a poetic language can keep up with the language of like military and military technology that's constantly changing and shifting. And so if a weapon, for example, stops being used, then that definition will fall away. The definition for look itself doesn't appear in the future edition. So in the current edition, well, I haven't checked today, but in the last edition that I've checked rather recently, it no longer existed. The word drone, for example, does not exist anymore. And one other reason that they give for revisions done is that the word has entered common English use. So a word like drone, that would make sense, right? That in 2007, it's still a supplement to what the English dictionary or our own standard usage might call it. But now, why would the DoD need to define it? Yeah. That would be my guess, yeah.
seems like you are redeeming the language through your own moral stance toward it, coming up with a way to think about it in a different way. Is that true? And did you find that to be something that was generative for you, or is it more?
I would say I'm definitely the compulsion behind it. I mean, is moral. You know, it's a moral imperative. But I have not been able to find the verb for what it is I was trying to do. So redeem doesn't quite feel right. Sometimes it feels like just revealing. Sometimes it feels like grieving. Sometimes it feels like not redeeming, but laying to rest, even the word. And I believe my role isn't really to, as a poet, isn't to redeem or maintain a kind of purity of language, but to maintain an aliveness of language. And language is a democratic medium that we collectively are constructing all the time. And so the DoD's violence is one of lexicography in addition to one of military technology, right? It's the kind of, the attempt to fix language top down in a way that then limits how we use it and determines how we use it. So in that way, morally, I was compelled to try and use them as differently as possible in as many different contexts as possible, including redemption at times.
Can you talk about writing a collection of poetry and how you knew when you were finished and how you organized?
Yeah, I thought I was finished so many times before I was actually, I worked on this book for about 8 years. And when I look at it now, I think, I probably wrote, I wrote at least 20 versions of it, and probably more, but there were 3 big versions that feel like 3 different books, almost. And each of those versions required me to order them in wildly different ways and to drop things that I had grown very attached to over 8 years. So actually, most of the original poems, the sources of the rest of the book, are no longer in the book. Even though I still love them and I wish they could be, but the book had outgrown them. And what had started as, I thought, a rewrite of a dictionary where I would take a term and give an image of warfare, became, as I did hundreds of those, I realized how limiting and limited that was, because I was just using the language of war to describe lands that we only see through the lens of war, namely Iraq and Afghanistan at the time. And to kind of define warfare and describe war using images that we already associate with warfare. Those spectacular moments of violence, right? Which is important to name and write, but if a whole book becomes that, then it becomes almost a replication of any media source, regardless of what I'm actually trying to do behind it, and I didn't want to do that. But the final big shift was actually that personal effects poem that I read. And that came very late, and I thought I had already written all I had to say about him in the book already. And I had not.
I have a question about your writing process as well. When you write a poem, do you have in mind what you're going to write about? Like, for example, luck. There are so many different elements going on there once, and you tie them all together at the end. Did you know what you were doing when you wrote luck?
No, I did not. I tried to do so many things with it, and some of those elements are years old, and it had nothing to do with the version. I thought what I wanted to do, what held true throughout was that I felt that the book was rather finished, and I wanted to write a kind of, I thought it was going to be a preface to the book. And I thought that preface was actually going to be a kind of ode to a friend of mine whose name is Samira Yamin, and with whom I had collaborated on a visual art project around war photography, and who had and that was the origin of the book, right? And so this really just started as basically a love letter to my friend, and then it just kept growing and she's nowhere to be found in it anymore, and all of a sudden the thing from 7 years ago is like, the second to last stanza or whatever. And once I found that kind of the whereas, therefore structure of, that's when the poem started to click together, and that's when certain things had to fall away. Yeah.
To be honest, this reading today is my introduction to your poetry. I feel like the poems that you read, you are bearing witness to certain events, to people. I'm just wondering what else you might consider to be part of a poet's job description.
I'm always dissatisfied with the answer I keep coming back to for myself right now is that I think that the poet's role is to, frankly, to remind us that we are going to die and that we're not dead yet. And so what does that speech sound like? And what is it that you need to regard, and what happens to our attention and quality of attention when we look at the world or we look at our loved one through that stance rather than the one that we carry every day. That's the best I can do.
So then taking that in stride and looking at the 3 poems that you read for us today, what do you feel when you write them, and then how do you feel after you've read them to us today?
Today?
Yeah, like what were you feeling when you read to us in that moment?
It's pretty out of body. It's pretty out of body. So I don't know, I feel like I disappear in a way. It used to be very hard for me to read without crying. And that's still hard for, something that I get really embarrassed admitting. Very hard for me to write without that necessarily, with a lot of poems and a lot of the material that I write. And I think that's fine. I mean, I think that if I were writing about what I'm writing about, and if I was looking at the lives that I was looking at, and there wasn't any mourning happening, then maybe I shouldn't be writing about them. Tears aren't the only way to express that mourning, but that's how I know that I'm in it, right? But at this point, I've been reading these poems for quite some time. So I've been able to kind of create a little space between myself and between what's being said, and hoping that I think I'm always aware, regardless of the reading, of the fact that I have a microphone in front of me, and so many people have been denied a microphone, or so many people have been killed because of one and what they've said behind one. And so I have that in me as I'm reading.
I don't remember what the context was, but I think just before you read, you were mentioning the material that a poet has the right to write about, and material that a poet does not have the right to write about. I've been, going around in my head, and I'm not quite sure I understand that. Could you speak about that a little bit?
I mean, I think there are lots of ways in which the other or people who are distant from us and our experience and our understanding and our history and our culture and our time have been written that have been violent, have been degrading, have been in the service of imperialism and colonialism. And I think right now there's a lot of conversation specifically around how can say, this is how I'm understanding the question at least, right? Like, can a white writer write a black character if they are not, right? Can I write a Latino character that's from El Paso? I've never been to, like, can I do these things? Can I actually embody identities and experiences that are different from my own? And I think it's an important conversation, and they're really important questions, because for a long time it's been taken for granted one way or the other. but my response has been that that question of do I have a right, whenever I hear the question of do I have a right to write that thing, or I'm asking that question of myself, my follow-up to that is always, okay, but do you have the responsibility to write that thing? Okay, if you have the responsibility, then can you find a way to do it, you know? So, yeah. And I think my uncle, it's one place where one could easily be like, oh, but she has a right to write. I don't think, my family in Iran probably would be like, you haven't even met him. You didn't live here you didn't walk past his room every day, like all those things that, I didn't have to actually deal with. And so I feel like if I can apply my imagination to him, why would I stop with him?
What does your artistic or creative process look like?
It's a mess.
I'm curious as to like when you start writing your poems, because I write poetry as well, amateurly, right? But
Me too.
it's cathartic, and it really gets the emotion out. But I like to write with a pencil and paper, and I like feeling my words on the paper. Do you like when you get an idea for a revision? Do you jot that down, or do you do most of your poetry on a computer, or how do you write your?
I do. I write pen and paper, and that's the first draft just about always ends up being pen and paper. And I revise on a computer. Sometimes I use a manual typewriter for like a first draft, but I hate typing on it doesn't work for me. It's too fast. I like the feedback of a pen. And manual typewriter is closer to that. It's at least there's some time and it takes some care in how you're moving in a way that is closer to the act of writing. And I don't know what parts of the brain exactly. I've looked this up and learned it and forgotten it promptly. But like different parts of the brain are, lit up when you use different mediums. So I'm a firm believer in writing longhand. Sometimes, I'm not going to lie and say I do this all the time, but to revise a poem by longhand too. Like take the poem and then copy it again and copy it again by hand, instead of typing it up and copy and pasting it. There are going to be a lot of things maybe that you don't want to copy by hand, It's like that sentence might not fly anymore because you're too tired to script it out, And so that's helpful too, I think, sometimes, as a litmus test for what is actually alive. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone.